Hello everyone and welcome to episode 1 of the second series I'm making of real-time tutorials on painting miniatures from the A Song of Ice and Fire tabletop miniatures game produced by Cool Mini or Not. In this series we'll be painting up another 3 miniatures this time, and we'll be doing it a little bit faster. My goal when I was painting these in reality was to try and get all these miniatures done on a lazy Sunday morning, and actually I did, in about 2 hours 45 minutes, maybe 3 hours, not all of which was brush on miniature time. I managed to paint all 3 of these up to a standard that I'm actually really happy with, and hopefully you will be as well. Just like the last series, I'll be doing this as real-time painting tutorials followed by a summary episode at the end, so that you can watch everything step by step and follow every brush stroke if you wish to, and you get a summary after everything is done that you can follow through from start to finish in a single sitting. The first step for any miniatures I work on is always priming them. I do this with my airbrush and Vallejo Gray Surface Primer, which I've found to be a very reliable primer, and whose pale color really works well with the ink washes that we're going to be using later on to actually color the miniatures. Before this, I have taken the time to wash these miniatures in soapy water and rinse them off and let them dry, just to remove any products or chemicals that may have been left on them from the factory. A lot of factories use mold release chemicals to stop the molds from sticking to the miniatures, and that can also stop your paint from sticking to your miniatures. By giving the miniatures a thorough wash and priming them, we're making sure that we're going to get the best possible grip of our paint or ink on the miniatures as we possibly can, stopping them from chipping and getting damaged when we go ahead and play with them later on. Before we get on to actually priming the miniatures though, time for a little PSA on cleaning out your airbrush. As you can see, I'm actually getting some blowback into the hopper of the airbrush. What ended up causing that was, although I had cleaned my airbrush after the last use, a little bit of dried primer or paint or probably varnish, since that was the last thing I did with it, had probably flaked off between the washing and coming out to use it again now. That little flake would have made its way into the chamber of the airbrush and blocked up the needle a little bit, such that the air was not able to escape the front ways and was coming out the top ways. To clear it out, I'm firing some airbrush flow improver through, because the Vallejo flow improver, while it's not technically a thinner, not on the bottle anyway, does actually have thinning properties and actually does a pretty good job of, well, dissolving and thinning our paints. That's actually why I use it both as a thinner and as a flow improver, and actually very rarely use it in my airbrush. I normally use it for thinning my paints that are going to go on a brush because of its properties in removing the surface tension of the paints. I'll talk about that a little later in one of the future episodes, and I've also talked about it in Season 1 if you want to go back. The episode I think is titled A Little Aside on Flow Improvers. But that's about the gist of it. So right now I'm just firing that stuff through, and I'm trying to dissolve whatever little blockage was in there. When you're dealing with your airbrush, I'm going to make a little video later with some more in-depth sort of care and feeding of your airbrush kind of stuff. But big tip here is, if you notice there's a blockage or something, there's very, very few moving parts in an airbrush, and you should get reasonably familiar with all of them so that you can take them out, maintain them, clean them yourself as you go along. Potentially the most fragile one of them all, I mean most of them are metal with the exception of a couple of rubber gaskets, but the most fragile one of them all is the needle. Bending or damaging the needle can actually cause bad flow as well, which was what I was kind of worried about in this case. Maybe my needle had been broken. It hasn't. As you can see, I'm now dusting the miniatures from a reasonable distance away, just making sure to get a very, very thin coat of primer on the miniatures as we go. As I was saying though, if it was needle damage that was obstructing the flow, then it would have been very hard to repair and might have even needed me to replace the needle in the end, which is not great. Fortunately, that wasn't the case. It was just a little blockage, did some quick troubleshooting, and off we go. So, like I said, we're going to be dusting our miniatures with this primer. Dusting just sort of indicates that I'm not getting the airbrush right up close. I'm sort of dusting them from a long distance away, making sure that it's a sort of broad, thin flow that's landing on the miniatures, because we don't want to obstruct any of the surface details. Those surface details are going to be serving to give us really easy shading and highlighting as our inks flow from the high points to the recesses later on when we're actually coloring them. One big change you'll notice as far as my workflow goes from the last season is, although I'm still using the little stepper box to elevate my miniatures to a point where they're slightly more comfortable to paint, and I'm still trying to paint them as a batch while I'm airbrushing, I'm now using corks as sort of makeshift miniature holders, miniature grips. Some of you may have seen there's actually been Kickstarters for miniature grips out there, and there are some for sale. I think Citadel has a miniature grip with it's like some sort of chaos clamp thing with some springs that holds your miniatures in place. But frankly, cost versus value for those I didn't find to be too great. So I made some of my own, and they feel pretty good in the hand, and I actually have been experimenting with different models of miniature grips for myself, which you'll see later as well. For now, though, these corks, they make a really nice hourglass shape, and they grip to the table surface very well if you put a little bit of sticky tack underneath them. So they've been serving quite well, and I would recommend them if you just got some corks kicking around, or if you have a dollar store near you that sells corks and other little craft supplies for scrapbooking. You can probably find something similar. As far as the actual airbrushing goes, you see I've dusted all sides of the miniatures now, and I'm just moving around to doing detail, making sure everything is hit. If there's any areas, any undercuts, such as behind Bronn's shield here, or under Jaime's cape, then I'm just going to be hitting it with a little more primer to make sure that everything is covered. Once I've got complete coverage, that completes the priming stage of these miniatures. As you're priming, again, make sure you don't get too thick of a layer on top. We're trying to make sure the surface details continue to show through. If you see any pooling, you can dab it away with a dry brush, as long as you get to it very, very quickly after you've laid it on. This Vallejo surface primer in particular starts to set up a surface tension fairly quickly, drying on the outside, and you can find that it'll mess up a little bit if you go back to it later and wick it away. That being said, you're probably still better off wicking away big pools than letting them sit. Our next step is going to be a dry brush to really pull out all of the highlights on the miniature. To do that, I'm using Artist's Loft cheap white acrylic. That was that big tub that I just showed there. And I'm knocking my marbles around. That's for my casting stuff. I'm hoping to make a video on sculpting miniatures and casting them later, but that's for the future. For now, get some white paint on a wide bristled brush you don't like too much anymore, and to dab it in, make sure that it gets right deep up inside the bristles. It's actually that deep paint that's going to do the work when we're dry brushing. If you're like me when I was first starting out painting, and presumably some of you are because that's why I'm producing these real-time videos, to fill that niche that I had hoped would exist when I was first starting painting, where I could follow along with every step without speed painting or edits, sort of cutting out the parts I wanted to see. Then maybe you don't know what dry brushing really does. So I'm just going to explain it quickly here while we're watching me do it. By dry brushing, we're basically pressing paint right up deep inside the bristles of the brush so that it's more than just on the tip. You know, it's if you're just running your brush into your paint and then going out and putting it on a miniature, it's the tips of the bristles that are going to carry the most paint. In this case, however, we're pressing it up deep inside the bristles so that there's more length of bristle covered in paint, and then we're drying the brush off on a tissue. Drying the brush on the tissue without stamping it down the way we stamped down to push the paint up inside the bristles is not going to dry the inside of the brush. It's just going to wipe the paint off of the tips and the outsides. What this means is when we pull our brush over the surfaces of the miniature in front of us, the tips and the outside of the brush, those bristles, are not carrying paint and therefore not pushing paint in as deep as, you know, the tip of the bristles is going to go inside the recesses of your miniature. However, when the bristles get sort of pulled back in the brushing action across the surface, that deep paint is going to be released onto all the elevated areas of the miniature that are getting touched by the deeper, further area of the brush, if that makes any sense. What that means, effectively, is dry brushing is a fairly quick and effective way of highlighting areas, of making sure that only the raised areas of a miniature receive paint, while the lowered areas do not. It does make a bit of a sketchy effect. You'll notice, especially depending on how dry your brush is, how good the bristles are, etc. You may get sort of streaks from it. You may get some spackling depending on how you actually apply it. I tend to be fairly forceful in doing it in long, quick strokes, as you can see. And that can make a bit of a texture from your dry brushing. So you'll want to keep that in mind as you're applying it. But in this case, that won't matter because a little bit of texture underneath our inks is just fine. And the contrast between this white and the light gray Vallejo primer is not all that huge. So the effect is somewhat subdued. What we're really just trying to do here is we're trying to make sure that all of those raised areas have a little bit of extra pop to push through and help us with our quick shading later on. Dry brushing is a really quick process, so I do it every time. Even though the effect is kind of minor, it really doesn't take away from my workflow all that much. Especially when you're putting on this small amount of paint, it doesn't take very long to dry either, at least dry to the touch to the point where you can start working with other things over top. You'll also get a much more stark effect if you use a darker primer or a combination of darker primers. Later on, I actually, with my next batch of miniatures, I tried zenithal highlighting, which is a different sort of highlighting, which I'll explain later when we actually get around to it. But it uses a darker base color than the surface color, basically. So I'm going to end up mixing black primer with gray primer and using that as my base primer for my miniatures, and you'll see that dry brushing and other effects will show up a little bit more. It makes for a grittier effect, a darker effect, but also more stark contrast between light and shadow, which some of you may like. Of course, that's for next season, so that's something to look forward to. For now, just fire your dry brushing on the miniatures fairly quickly like this, especially on areas like Cersei's robes here, where you can see there's a lot of wrinkles and stuff that we want to pull out from the background, because they're going to give a lot of texture when we go ahead. With all that said, we finished up for this episode, so I hope this was informative and I hope you enjoyed it. We're going to be changing up the format a little bit more as we go forward with my future episodes, but if you have any comments, put them down below. Same with any feedback, any tips you have for other painters or for me. Honestly, throw it all in the comments. I'll take a look, I'll answer it. I love to read anything you want to throw for me. Until next time, go play some games.